Maria Bergh, class of 2012, 12 MArch and MCP. Maria practices restorative justice through farming, architecture, narrative, and design. She earned her BS Arc, MArch, and MCP from UC in 6 short years, using her cooperative education experiences to travel the country from sea to shining sea. Maria's nomadic lifestyle and tendency to take on a little too much didn't end after graduation, much to her chagrin. Working or playing, her favorite thing is when she's able to get just a little bit lost in the present moment. Maria, you have the stage.
Thanks. When I was last in this room 10 years ago, I would never have thought that I would have started my own firm. And so this is the story of how I went from a little before UC to here. We moved to Cincinnati, Ohio when I was 5. My dad worked for the Cincinnati Enquirer. And we lived in a suburb on the east side where all of the houses were full and all of the streets were empty. And when I went downtown with my dad, I noticed that the streets were full of a vibrant Black community, but the houses were empty. And as a young child, I wondered why that was. Because we were an Enquirer family, the newspaper landed on our breakfast table every morning. And that newspaper, 21 years ago today, had the story of Timothy Thomas, a 19-year-old Black man who was killed by the police this week 21 years ago. His death was as he was running away. He was shot in the back. There was a warrant out for his arrest based on racial profiling, which we heard a little bit about in the previous presentation. His death sparked an uprising, which was called a race riot at the time because we didn't have the words 20 years ago. And that uprising included a Black boycott of downtown Cincinnati, which disinvested millions of dollars from downtown businesses. This community was committed to seeking reparations and justice for the death of this young man. And that rippled worldwide. When Zaha Hadid got her first architecture commission in Cincinnati for the Contemporary Arts Center, this was her partie. Her partie was wrapping that sidewalk culture I'd seen up into an elite white institution and provoking a reckoning. But that kind of faded, except in the young people who remembered it. I was confronted by this story by young people, so I could not forget it, as my privilege might have allowed me to otherwise. And so I came to the University of Cincinnati hoping to learn about how architecture could create this kind of justice for people who did not have space provided to them and for the injustices that were going untold. And I discovered when I arrived here that that wasn't exactly on the syllabus in the early 2000s, but it is in the library if you look, if you're really dedicated. And I was also a little bit lucky that it was happening on the streets. Because at the time that I was at UC, 3CDC was formed. And for those of you who've been around Cincinnati for a while, you'll remember that 3CDC is a nonprofit founded by the 10 largest employers in Cincinnati, Ohio, to promote the redevelopment of Over the Rhine and downtown to attract young professionals and top talent to the city. 3CDC was funded by the top 10 employers of Cincinnati who are having challenges recruiting and retaining top talent with a downtown neighborhood that was still impoverished in part by the Black boycott and also through systemic generations of disinvestment. 3CDC had that intent. That was an intent, and they also had an impact. And they, at the time, were very clear that their intent was not to cause gentrification, and their intent was not to cause erasure of this story and this young man and the community that had so much power. But that was the impact. When I live in Chicago now, when I hear about people visiting Cincinnati, they tell me about waffles and beer. They don't tell me about the story of Timothy Thomas and this community. And the thing that hurt as a student at the University of Cincinnati is that I was sitting in this lecture hall hearing about the history of architecture and being told that architecture didn't have the power to cause social change because Pruitt-Igoe fell decades ago and the end of modernism had happened and design was no longer capable of creating social change. And I could see downtown that UC, as one of those top 10 employers, was paying millions of dollars for social change to be created to protect wealthy white individuals. It just wasn't accessible for people of color. And so when I was last in this room, I was faced with those sorts of questions. And I felt like there had to be an answer. But the only answer I saw required me either to start my own business, which was terrifying, or to maybe become an activist, which was equally terrifying. I didn't think I had what it took, and I also wasn't sure that it would make a difference, frankly. So I went ahead and I forgot to advance my slides and got a job as a designer in Dallas, Texas at a nonprofit. And so I spent my first year after graduation working with a Black neighborhood called Mill City to find tools to empower that community to understand how they wanted to see themselves in the future and how they could get there using advocacy and building their own power. And as we were planning our analysis meeting after about a year had gone by to understand what we had accomplished together, something unforeseeable had happened. I walked into that meeting and it was actually a press release because one of our key stakeholders was wanted by the police in a serial rape trial, a serial rape case. And as we listened to the explanation, this man who called himself Mr. Crime Watch, Mr. Community Watch, it all fell into place. And I was getting text messages and calls from my mom and my employer saying, be safe, go home, take care of yourself. And I was being asked for hugs and reassurance from the community I'd worked with for a full year to help them understand, to help them know that they were still loved, that they weren't going to be seen as criminals, that all of our hard work was not going to be wasted, that that relationship would continue. And I knew two things. Deep down, I knew that I had privilege and that I was not at any risk in that situation, really. And I also knew that I didn't have what it took to be in that room in the way that I needed to be. I hadn't been trained. They don't teach this in school. And so over the next few years, I realized that becoming an activist was going to have to be part of my story because I had to be able to be in those rooms. I had to have the skills to do what I thought I wanted to do. And so I continue to work in community in different ways. And it was this charrette, which is with a disabled community. If you haven't worked with a disabled community in your design process, if you haven't created a way for people who can't see, can't hear, can't move without mobility aids, are neurodivergent and can't follow the discussion, then they're not being a part of your design process and your design. I hate to use you because it sounds so accusatory, but our designs are actually disabling, right? Like people aren't disabled. What we build disables people. And so it was in this charrette where I had learned how to include people by listening to them and about their needs that I realized that not only did I need to be an activist, but I also needed to start a business because I actually loved every part of this process. I loved the business development. I loved the relationship building. I loved every single bit of it. And I was good enough at it, right? I was still learning, but I was doing something that people needed to be done in a way that made them feel better and made them see a future for themselves and their dreams. And so that was really impactful. I was still terrified, but I also loved what I was terrified by. And how can you not try and take a risk when you love something that you're terrified by? So I became an activist in real terms, right? I moved to Chicago. I lived in a house full of activists. I helped find ways to house families of immigrants and people who had experienced domestic violence. I learned so much from being in these communities, from being on the streets, from helping arrange a variety of protests from Black Lives Matter to sustainability to affordable housing here, the Women's March. And I also, as I was learning and understanding things, shared it back out, right? So I was leading trainings on anti-racism and workshops and retreats. I was co-founding an environmental justice cooperative with a bunch of engineers who were pretty geeky, but pretty fun. And finding ways to connect to this wide network of community. And this wide network of community, it turns out, also turned right around and supported me back. And so this weird network, we all have weird networks, right? My weird network of activist friends allowed me to have really low startup for a design firm and also became my contacts and my clients until I was able to do that full time. So now for the last 2 or so years, I've been basically a full-time designer again, as I was before this all. But my clients are my friends and my co-activists and the people I live with and the people I have grown vegetables with. And We have, we watch each other, I watch their kids and things happen. So this is kind of the story that I think is important to tell, is that there are more ways to get to your dreams. There are more ways to find your community and to make change than we know. It's not just the pathways that we see open to us. Every decision that we make, our networks, they all matter. And I'm here in part today because I'm hopeful to ask you all to think a little bit more about your impact and your intent, right? We all have intent when we do design, and we all know what that intent is. But our impact isn't always the same, as I said at the beginning. And we do have the power to create social change when we think about aligning our impact and our intent a little bit more. When we know, like I have learned, that we learn from those around us, that the people who we are working with and for have as much to teach us as our teachers and our coworkers and our colleagues. And so I hope in some little way that I've helped with that message, because I'm here today because I stand on and with all of my neighbors in Black and brown communities on the south and west sides of Chicago who are so often discounted and counted out. And I hope together that we can provoke some of that reckoning, right? Some of that reckoning that Zaha Hadid saw in that Contemporary Arts Center downtown that inspired me when I was quite young. So thank you so much.